Okay, so tell me a little bit about your background and how you got involved in the disability community.
Yes, sure. Uh, this spring, I graduated with my master's degree in museum studies from the University of Washington. And while I was a student there, I had the opportunity to intern with the Do It Center, which I know you're familiar with, the Disabilities Opportunities in Networking and Technology Center on the University of Washington's campus. Um, my particular internship was with their access to informal STEM learning. And so that subset of informal learning also includes museums, which is why it was a good fit for me. And over the course of that internship, I had the chance to research accessible museum practices and broadly um, the needs of disability communities in museum spaces that really aren't being met at this point in time. Engage with a local museum in my hometown, the Riverside Art Museum in Riverside, California. And I was there to assess the accessibility of a virtual program that they were offering at the time. This was right when COVID was rampant, so they were pretty much only doing virtual programming. And I did a little assessment for them about how they could make this particular program more accessible in the online space. Um, and this led to a large project where I had the chance to partner with a regional vocational organization, Blindness Support Services. So they're down in Riverside, California as well. Um, and we created and piloted tactile art experiences for museum visitors with low and no vision for a photography exhibit. And then that project was then expanded into my master's thesis project, um, where we created tactile experiences with verbal descriptions for the Cheecham Center for Chicano Arts and Culture, also in Riverside. That's a new museum that just opened this year. So a large portion of this project was also developing like an implementation manual that increased organizational knowledge surrounding this community and museum program. So I'm certainly new to the space of disability advocacy in academia, but I have been really fortunate to have some great mentors and partners in that work that I've done so far. And I think similarly, a lot of my peers in my graduate program are doing amazing work that broadens museum access for visitors with disabilities. So I've also been really influenced by their projects and their efforts and stuff like that.
Cool. So like I know that you work in like museums now, so like what are your roles in like those museums with like making things more accessible for people with disabilities?
Right. So when I was at the Riverside Art Museum and the Cheecham Center for Chicano Arts and Culture, it certainly was, I would say, in a programmatic capacity. So I was looking at how to make programs more accessible, and that kind of encapsulates like a lot of different access barriers. So in programming, you can have like physical space access barriers, informational space access barriers, like social stigma barriers. So it was kind of like working on how to address that those particular sections of programming for the audience that I was working with. So personally, I've worked with the low and no vision community, and so that's to say that I don't have experience working with all disability communities, and I recognize that different communities have different needs in museum spaces. Um, and so thinking through all of those different spheres of access barriers, I kind of brought the conversation to the community through my community partner, which was Blindness Support Services. Um, and the format that was ultimately chosen for that particular project came straight out of listening sessions that I held with that particular community. There was like a lot of barriers that were identified in those particular access spheres that I mentioned earlier. So it was just really thinking through how those different areas of the museum contribute a lot to barriers and um, just in accessibility for particular museum visitors.
Cool. So like if I could just like dive into like your research and because I understand you've done like your thesis, um, like like what kind of thesis work have you done in terms of like accessibility?
Right. Yeah, so I was fortunate enough to do a research project. So my particular program allowed me to work with a host institution. I think the museum field is unique because you can do both research, but also it's a practical field, right? Like you're making products and processes and exhibits and stuff like that. So I had the opportunity to do this particular project. Um, and a really large portion of that project was what so I was very interested in making something that was actually useful for the community, right? I didn't want to make something that was inaccessible to this community that I had promised um, to make an accessible art experience for. But another portion of this project that I was really interested in, and something that is like an up and coming discussion, I think, in the museum field, um, is how do you make an organization, not just an individual like myself, how do you make an organization like ready to continue this type of work, right? So I think a big fear of mine is leaving an organization and then that access work like dropping off because I'm not the person that's doing it, right? So I was really interested in creating something that could really help foster like organizational knowledge around how to support disability communities and how to create um, pathways for conversations, pathways to connect with the museum. Um, so as a part of that project, I essentially wrote up a manual that has like a strategy of how to engage with communities, particularly disability communities. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it totally. Um, yeah, but like, yeah, so like, how does that sort of research influence, like the st because I understand you work with a lot of stakeholders, so I'm
Hmm.
wondering what kind of, how does your research sort of um like, how does that help you in your efforts towards of like opportunities to provide for like disability advocacy and things like that. Because yeah, I understand you worked at the Riverside Art Museum and the Cheech Marin Center of Chicano Studies. So
Yeah.
like, how does that research contribute to your efforts in the community?
Yeah, certainly. So I think what that work was able to do was kind of solidify how I personally want to approach the type of work that I want to do, which is through authenticity, through partnership, through genuine connection. I think that it's really easy for museums to tokenize disability communities when they're doing, one-off connections where it's like, well, we can partner with this disability community on this one particular project, and then that community really isn't involved in anything moving forward. They're not asked for consultation or to be on an advisory board or something like that. Um, so I think that that particular component of my work is how I personally approach connecting with people. And I think that, you know, that gets done, that reflection of how we're connecting and how we're approaching people and how we're doing this work is both something that can be done on an individual level and also on an organizational level, right? So I think that if a museum is looking to embark on this type of work, that they kind of first need to look inward into their organizational culture and do some heavy lifting to make sure that staff and leadership are prepared to undertake access work. So this requires looking at like resource allocation, right? Like where are you putting your money? Are you putting your money towards the programs that are working to increase access? You know, um, program and exhibition priorities. Are you doing the bare minimum? Is like ADA compliance the only thing that you're looking to do in an exhibition? Staff preparedness and training. Is staff aware of the resources that visitors have when they come visit the museum? Like, are they able to help somebody at the drop of a hat if they need a help or assistance? And establish community partnerships as well as like long-term goals and initiatives. So I think if a museum isn't doing that kind of reflective work, then it's possible to further alienate a community from what they're doing. Sorry, I kind of rambled a little bit there, but
No, no, that's fine. That's valid. That's a valid point. So like what can museums do to like reduce the stigma of disability? Because there's like ableism and stuff like that that it's really kind of harsh for people in those communities. So like how can museums what can museums do to sort of reduce that stigma and then tackle it head on? Um,
right. Yeah, I mean, I think that like I said, doing that reflective work and doing it in partnership with a community that will provide you like just very straight feedback on essentially doing a an audit of your accessibility for your museum, and that requires bringing in outside people. It would be great to have community partners also be a part of that effort, and then looking at those areas of access barriers and strategically thinking, how are we going to address these as an organization? And I think in order to do that, you also really have to recognize like the harm that museums have historically done. If that isn't also getting addressed in this equation, I think, you know, there's really no way that a museum can go forward unless it does actually do that internal work where it's like, okay, this is what we've done to really perpetuate ableism, access barriers, alienation, etc. And then how can we grow? How can we counteract these things? So I do think that it takes that reflective work. And then on top of that, like I mentioned previously, entering into a partnership with a community partner, somebody like Blindness Support Services that really can be an advocate for the museum to a community that you probably otherwise wouldn't have a conversation with, right? Like disability communities have no reason to trust museums. Why? Why would they have a reason to trust museums when they've really been exclusive for the whole of their existence, mostly? Um, so fostering that partnership is really important because it provides like a sense of accountability for the organization and also the people it serves. So I would, you know, I would love to see every museum have an advisory board of people with disabilities and have people with disabilities on their staff and their board and in their leadership positions. I think that uh, that would also be a great way to help start to turn some of those practices that we've created for ourselves as a field.
yeah, it's a really great starting point, but I think it could use some like improvement to do a lot of the work to make things more accessible.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we can certainly talk about things like physical access, right? I mean, like um there's a whole lot of talk about exhibition design. So, historically speaking, exhibition design has been really exclusive to particular subsets of disability communities. So, you know, label text is frequently something that I hear people from the low and no vision community talk about as something that's like really inaccessible to them. When text on the wall is like 10-point font, right? And it's like in the dark. Obviously, anybody's going to have an issue reading that, but especially people with low or no vision. So that's standard practice, right? To have those types of things in the museum field. And so having a really hard look at field-wide practices, right? um, can definitely move the field forward. Like, why do we need to have 10-point font for our labels? Why can't we make them really big? Why can't we provide, if people are really sticklers about that, why can't we provide like big font text alternatives as well? You know what I mean? Um, so that's certainly something that the field is kind of coming to terms with right now. And then also information access, right? So anything that's audio, you know, you need to have some sort of alternative means to access that for people that aren't able to access it with audio. So in terms of the visual artwork, because all of the pieces that we worked with were visual 2D artwork. So it wasn't just as simple as like printing a 3D sculpture or something like that where people can physically handle it. Um, how do they access that visual information? It has to be done through another mean. It has to be done through, and this came up in the listening sessions. People were adamant about touch being a sense that they really connected with, and audio being a sense that they really connected with. So thinking through how do you translate a visual experience into an audible and a tactile experience. So I think a lot of people would be like, well, a visual painting is a visual painting, and there's no way that people can access it. But there's like some really creative ways that you can uh, change the way that people are experiencing your museum, I think. And I never would have been able to come up with the format for that project if I hadn't held those listening sessions and I hadn't gotten to know pretty deeply what the particular needs of that community were, you know? So it's not just something I think that museum professionals can like assume what any particular community needs at a point in time. There really has to be that deep discussion happening in order for uh, a museum to get to know what particularly in their museum they need to change, you know?
Yeah, I agree. It's a lot of work, but it's not impossible for museums to really do the work. But yeah, yeah.
And that's what I was saying earlier about intention. So having a good idea of what these long-term goals and initiatives are, um, I think is really important. Like, obviously, a museum cannot become entirely accessible to everyone overnight. That's just impossible in the world that we live in, unfortunately. Um, but it takes one step at a time to be able to accomplish a goal that you have. And I think it's important to understand that, access work for disability communities is a step-by-step process, but it's also not piecemeal. So it's not being done like willy-nilly, um, doing it with intention and having a goal in mind and having a plan after the museums have done that reflective work of where do we need to get to? Where have we been and where do we need to get to? Like that's the really important piece, I think, is having sustained access, right? Continuing the work um, over time rather than just having these one-off situations where, particular disability communities are like, well, they talked to me once, but never again, so I think that
Mhm.
that's kind of the work that museums need to steer away from, and really start thinking about some like long term, how are we going to substantially connect with the communities that we serve.
Yeah, totally agree.